Noah building the ark with 5 decks. God, I really think the boat needs to have 5 decks on it. We got to separate the tigers from the rabbits. We got to have 5 decks. We can't imagine Noah arguing with God like that, can we? God says 3 decks. Noah did what God commanded him to do, so we put 3 decks in the ark. You see, what God commands authorizes what God commands. You do what God commands. But at the same time, as we have already suggested, there were things that God did not command. God did not specify what type of tools to use. Now, there's no doubt at that age and at that time that the wide range of tools we have available today were not available. And so Noah used what he had on hand. Noah used what was normal to use in shipbuilding. But if God had said, Noah, I want you to build an ark 350 cubits by 50 cubits by 30 cubits with a jigsaw, some of us would have said, it would have been a whole lot easier to use a circular saw. But if God specifies a jigsaw, then you need to use a jigsaw. Well, I don't understand why you have to use a jigsaw. It doesn't matter if you don't understand why. God said to do it with a jigsaw. Maybe there's a purpose or a design in the art that requires a jigsaw that I don't see and I don't comprehend. But if God says to use a specific tool, what God authorizes, He authorizes. But now God didn't tell Noah what tools to use. And so Noah was at liberty to use the tools that were available to him that would help him accomplish what God commanded him to accomplish. Now we fast forward to the New Testament era, to the discussion that we have going on with our denominational friends about why we do not use mechanical instruments of music and worship. And the bottom line is that God has authorized what He has authorized. Same thing with Noah. The 2 primary passages that deal with this question are Ephesians chapter 5, verse 19, and Colossians chapter 3, and verse 16. There's about a half a dozen other verses that talk about our worship and song in the New Testament era. Ephesians 5, verse 19. Paul writes, don't be drunk with wine, wherein is dissipation or excess or recklessness, but be filled in the Spirit, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. So what God has authorized there is singing, speaking, that is verbal, and it is vocal. It's vocal in a sense that we've got to use our voices. It's the thankfulness and the praise that we feel in our hearts that it is expressed through the instrument of our voices. You see, that's the instrument that God has authorized. But it is also verbal in the sense that humming does not fulfill the requirements. It's got to be verbal. It's got to be spoken words because we are speaking to one another, Paul says. We are encouraging one another. We are admonishing one another. We are teaching one another. And so the singing has a purpose. It's just not making noise. It is praising God. And it is teaching and encouraging one another. The second passage, of course, is Colossians 3 and verse 16, where Paul says, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with thankfulness in your heart to the Lord. So once again, God has specified how He wants us to make music and worship. He told us He wants us to sing. Now, Christians understood that for 600 years. For 600 years, there was not a question among Christians about how to worship God. They all did it a cappella, without the accompaniment of mechanical instruments. There's no doubt that the Jews did it in the Old Testament. There's no doubt about it that God commanded it in the Old Testament under David. If God commanded it in the Old Testament under David, don't we all think that God And when the Christians left Judaism, when they left worshiping under the law of Moses and they became Christians and began worshiping under Christ, they left the instruments behind with the animal sacrifices. That's a matter of historical record. And when pagans left pagan worship and they became Christians, they left the mechanical instruments in paganism. And they worshiped without the mechanical instrument when they became Christians. But when we look at the New Testament from Matthew to Revelation, there is no command for Christians to play. There is no example of Christians playing. There is no inference, implication, that the Christians worship with mechanical instruments. Everything shows just what I've mentioned. They understood that what God authorizes, He authorizes. Ephesians 5:19, Colossians 3:16, God authorized singing and worship to God. Now, that answers the question about mechanical instruments. But what about the pitch pipe? What about PowerPoint? What about song books? None of those are in the New Testament. What about our communion tracer? None of that's in the New Testament. Well, we go back to Noah and his tools. A command authorizes what you need to have in order to fulfill the command. And so when God told Noah, I want you to build the ark, I want you to make it out of gopher wood, God specified the type of wood He wanted to use. It doesn't matter whether Noah understood why or not. That's irrelevant. God said, I want you to use gopher wood, so Noah used gopher wood, which excludes everything else. It excludes pine. Maybe Noah liked the smell of cedar. Cedar would sure make that year and a few days on the ark a whole lot more tolerable. God, I love the smell of cedar. You know, what Noah liked was irrelevant. God said, I want you to use gopher wood. But God didn't tell Noah what kind of tools to use. And so Noah was at liberty to use the tools that he needed in order to fulfill the command that God gave him. So the same thing is true when we come to our worship in the New Testament times. But God says, I want you to sing and make melody in your hearts, of course. That authorizes singing. It authorizes what it authorizes, which means it excludes playing. But then, when we make melody, number one, we've got to have somebody to decide the melody to use. Right? You can't have 85 different melodies going on. It would sound like a bunch of squawking geese. And so somebody has to choose the melody. There's your authority for a song leader. But then he also has to decide what melody to sing. And there's your authority for the pitch pipe. Now we can all sing the same note. We can all sing soprano. God didn't specify what pitch, did He? He didn't specify what melody to sing. And so we can all sing soprano, or we can all sing in parts that fit our natural voices, which would be four-part harmony. So those are things that God has not specified, but we can do those because it helps us fulfill the command that God has given us. You see, it's also very simple when we go back and look at what the Bible actually teaches, rather than seeing what's going on around us. We go back and look at the simplicity of the Scriptures. Now, there are three other passages that I want us to look at to help emphasize this point. And we can multiply these verses, no doubt. Back in the occasion in Numbers chapters 22, 23, and 24, where the Israelites are in the wilderness, and we've got Balaam and Balak. Balak is the king of Moab who wants to curse the Israelites because he fears them. Balaam is the prophet. Now, Balaam is not a prophet of God. He's not an Israelite prophet. But God does work through him on this occasion. And Balak wants Balaam to curse the Israelites, and God appears to Balaam, and He says, do not say anything that I did not tell you to say. And so Balaam blesses the Israelites, and it makes Balak mad. And he goes back to Balaam and he says, I want you to do it a second time. And so God appears to Balaam a second time, and God says, Balaam, you only say what I tell you to say. So Balaam blesses the Israelites. It makes Balak mad again. And he goes back to Balaam and he says, oh, I'll give you more money. That's what it was all about from Balak's perspective. He says, I'll give you more money if you'll curse the Israelites. And so God appears to Balaam in a dream, and he said, Balaam, you only say what I tell you to say. And so Balaam goes and he blesses the Israelites. And when Balak asks Balaam why, Balaam tells him very simply what the Lord says, that I must speak. Balaam needed to understand that when he was speaking for God, silence is golden. What God has told me to say, I am going to say exactly what God has told me to say. And everything else I'm going to leave alone. I'm going to speak where God speaks, and I'm going to be silent where God is silent. That's exactly what we saw in Noah's case. And we see it here now in Numbers chapter 23, verse 26. We see it again in the limited commission when Jesus sent out his disciples during his lifetime. He says, when you are going to go before kings and governors, and you're going to represent me. And Jesus tells his disciples, he says, whatever you hear in the ear, that you will preach from the rooftops. And whatever you understand in the darkness, that you will speak in the light. Now let's look closely at what Jesus is saying. The what is the same thing as the that. What you hear is what needs to come out of your mouth. Nothing more, nothing less. Where I speak, you speak. Where I'm silent, you are silent. And so Jesus did not give his disciples authority to go teach and preach whatever they wanted to do. And he doesn't give us the authority to worship in whatever way we want to worship. Because silence with God is golden. And then the third passage is one that we're familiar with because we teach our children the song. Based on verses 24 through 27, Matthew chapter 7. The wise man built his house upon the rock. The rains descended, the floods came, the winds blew a bit upon the house, but it stood firm because it was built upon a rock. The point of the passage is, Jesus says, the one who builds his house upon the rock is the one who hears these sayings of mine and does them. That's the definition that teaches us in the opposite way, the definition of lawlessness. We go back to Matthew chapter 7, verse 21. Jesus says, not everyone who says unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father. Now that right there tells us what the definition of lawlessness is. He who does the will of my Father. That's the opposite of what lawlessness is. Lawlessness means being without God's will. That's what the word lawlessness means. And so Jesus says in verse 22, many will say unto me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name? Have we not cast out demons in your name? Have we not done many wonderful works in your name? Have we not worshipped 4 hours a day, 52 weeks out of the year, in your name? Jesus says, I will say to you in that day, depart from me, because I never knew you, because you practice lawlessness. Now those people thought that they were doing the Lord's will. In fact, they claimed it's the Lord's will. They said, we're doing this in your name. Prophesying, casting out evil spirits, and doing many wonderful works in your name. They said it was worship. They said it was with God's authority, yet it was not. Why? Because there was no will behind it. It was lawlessness. It was being without God's law. What God authorizes, He authorizes. The word lawlessness is found in the New Testament some 20 times. Most of the time it's about God sacrificing Jesus to forgive us of our lawlessness. Lawlessness requires the sacrifice of Christ. Lawlessness is what put Jesus on the cross. Doing things without God's permission. So 1 John 3 and verse 4 says that sin is